Rain falls above Wayne Manor tonight, soft and unhurried, the kind of rain that seems to slow the whole world down with it. Bruce Wayne returns from patrol the way he always does, quietly, without ceremony, the cape still damp against his shoulders, the cowl still cooling from the night air. The Batcave welcomes him the way it always has. The waterfall murmurs somewhere in the dark. The trophies stand where they always stand. The giant coin, the oversized card, the great mechanical dinosaur frozen mid-stride, forever guarding a joke only Gotham could have written. But tonight, Bruce doesn't stop here. He walks past the medical bay, past the case files, past the long wall of monitors still glowing faintly with Gotham's restless heartbeat. He walks until the cave narrows, until the ceiling lowers, until the air turns colder and older, carrying the mineral scent of stone that has never once felt sunlight. There is a door here that even most of the Justice League does not know exists. It is not hidden behind some clever mechanism, not guarded by lasers or fingerprint scanners. It is hidden the way the truth is often hidden, in plain sight, disguised as nothing worth noticing. A slab of ancient rock, indistinguishable from the cave wall around it, except for a single carved symbol near its base, worn smooth by decades of a gloved thumb tracing it in thought. Bruce presses his hand against the symbol now. Somewhere deep in the stone, something shifts. A low, mechanical hum awakens. Older technology layered beneath older stone. An elevator built long ago for a purpose he rarely speaks of, even to himself. The doors, steel, scarred, patient, slide open with a groan that echoes down into the dark like a held breath finally released. He steps inside. The descent takes almost 2 full minutes, long enough to hear his own heartbeat, long enough to remember why he built this place at all. When the doors open again, dust drifts through pale light, disturbed after months of stillness. The chamber beyond is vast, vaster than anyone would expect beneath a Gotham mansion, carved from bedrock that predates the manor, predates the city, perhaps predates memory itself. Stone archways stretch into shadow. Old iron sconces, retrofitted with dim electric bulbs decades ago, cast long, amber light across rows of glass cases. This is not the Batcave the world imagines. There are no criminal case files here, no evidence lockers, no trophies collected from ordinary villains, however extraordinary their crimes may have seemed at the time. Instead, resting behind glass and stone are things that should not exist. Ancient journals bound in cracked leather, their pages filled with a handwriting that grows more urgent, more disbelieving the further one reads. Artifacts torn from realms that were never meant to touch Gotham's soil. Fragments of prophecy written in languages that predate every human tongue. Broken relics. A shard of something that once glowed. A ring too heavy for its size. A helm scorched by fire that left no ash. Alien symbols etched into stone that pulse faintly, almost imperceptibly, as though something inside them is still, after all this time, quietly awake. Each one is a memory. Each one is a night Bruce Wayne stood in the presence of something that had existed long before humanity ever looked up and wondered what watched it back. He begins to walk. His footsteps are quiet across the worn stone floor, the same quiet control that has carried him across rooftops, through crime scenes, into rooms filled with monsters wearing human faces. But here, the quiet feels different, reverent, as if the chamber itself expects nothing less. He passes case after case, relic after relic, and with each one a memory rises, unbidden, patient, waiting its turn like it has waited for years. And near the center of the chamber, beneath the tallest archway, past the artifacts and the journals and the fragments of forgotten prophecy, there is one pedestal that holds nothing at all. No label, no relic, no explanation. Bruce's eyes pass over it the way they always do, briefly, deliberately, The way a man looks at an old wound he has long since stopped explaining to anyone, including himself. He does not stop there, not yet. Instead, he turns toward the nearest case, where the oldest journal in the entire archive waits beneath the glass, its cover cracked, its pages the color of old tea. And he lets himself remember the very first time he understood that some mysteries could not be solved with a magnifying glass and a working knowledge of human nature. The rain continues above him, muffled by hundreds of feet of stone. Down here, in the dark, the story begins. Every detective believes, at least once, that the world obeys rules. Bruce Wayne built his entire life on that belief. Somewhere in Gotham, a criminal leaves a fingerprint, a footprint, a motive that makes sense once you understand the wound behind it. Every crime, no matter how strange, could be traced back to a cause, a person, a choice. That belief carried him through years of training in the world's harshest corners, through the loss that shaped him, through the mask he built to stand between Gotham and the dark. And then, one night, the rules stopped applying. It happened early in his war on crime, before the cape had become a legend, when Batman was still, in many ways, an experiment Gotham hadn't decided whether to trust. He remembers the case only in fragments now. A string of disappearances near the old harbor, a cult meeting in the ruins of a church that had burned decades earlier, symbols painted across the walls in a script that matched nothing in any criminal database, any forgotten language, any human record he could find. He remembers descending into that church, expecting to find men, frightened, desperate, perhaps armed, but men. What he found instead was a presence, not a person, not a costume. Something that filled the room the way cold fills a cellar, seeping into the corners before you ever feel it against your skin. The cultists knelt before an altar, chanting words that seemed to bend the air itself, and at the center of it, barely visible, something ancient stirred, something that had been sleeping long before Gotham's first stone was laid. Batman did not fight that night. He couldn't have. Every instinct that had carried him through Gotham's underworld told him this enemy would not break under a well-placed strike or a clever piece of evidence presented at the right moment. This was not a man hiding a secret. This was a truth older than secrets themselves. So he did the only thing his training had never quite prepared him for. He watched. He studied the chant, the symbols, the pattern of the cultists' movements, the way the presence seemed to grow stronger with belief and weaker with doubt. He noticed, almost by accident, that when one of the cultists faltered, voice cracking, faith wavering, the presence in the room dimmed, just slightly, like a candle catching a draft. That was the first clue. Belief was fuel, uncertainty was a wound. He used it. He staged Gotham's oldest trick, the one every con artist and grifter in the city understood instinctively. He planted doubt. A single sentence, spoken clearly, aimed not at the entity, but at the cultists surrounding it. It doesn't even know your names. The chanting faltered. The presence recoiled, not from force, but from doubt spreading like a crack through old glass. By the time dawn touched the harbor, the church stood empty. The cultists scattered and confused, uncertain themselves what they had believed in at all. Batman never spoke of that night publicly. He barely spoke of it to himself. But he kept a fragment, a single scorched piece of the altar, carved with symbols he would spend the next 15 years slowly learning to translate. Standing before the case now, decades later, Bruce studies that same fragment beneath the glass. The symbols have not changed. He has. He understands now what he could only sense that night, that some enemies cannot be investigated the way a robbery or a murder can be investigated. Some enemies must be approached the way one approaches a language never meant to be spoken by human tongues. Patiently, carefully, with humility. That night taught him the first rule of facing the impossible. Do not assume the old rules apply. Find the new ones. Every mystery, no matter how vast, leaves a thread. Even the gods leave a thread. He steps away from the case, deeper into the archive, toward journals whose spines are cracked from years of handling, years of returning to this exact question again and again, refining an answer that would take him a lifetime to fully understand. The largest section of the archive is not filled with weapons or artifacts at all. It is filled with journals. Rows and rows of them, bound in leather that has aged the way old bark ages, cracked, silvered, worn soft in the places where hands have gripped them thousands of times. Bruce runs a gloved finger along their spines now, feeling the ridges of years of research, of theories tested and discarded, of patterns painstakingly assembled from evidence most beings would never think to examine. This is the truth very few people understand about Batman's encounters with gods. He never approached them as a warrior approaches a battlefield. He approached them exactly the way he approached Gotham's worst criminals, as puzzles wearing the shape of threats. Every criminal, no matter how monstrous, has patterns, a preferred method, a blind spot born from pride or fear or obsession. Every criminal believes something about themselves that isn't entirely true, and that belief becomes the crack in their armor. Bruce discovered, slowly and carefully, that gods were no different. He remembers the early years of building this theory, poring over mythology the way he once pored over case files, cross-referencing Sumerian tablets with Norse sagas, comparing the temperament of Egyptian deities to the temperament of Greek ones, searching for a single unifying truth beneath all of it. He filled notebook after notebook with observations that seemed, at the time, almost absurd to write down. Ares craves conflict, but he despises being ignored more than he despises losing. Circe's power depends on belief in her illusions. Break the belief, break the spell. Clarion draws strength from chaos, but chaos requires an audience. Remove the stage, and the performance falters. Each entry reads less like theology and more like a profile compiled on a particularly dangerous criminal. Because to Bruce, that is precisely what it was. Gods, in his experience, were beings of tremendous power wrapped around very old, very specific psychologies. They had been worshipped for centuries, sometimes millennia. Worship does something to a mind, mortal or otherwise. It calcifies expectation. It builds identity around certainty. I am feared. I am obeyed. I am eternal. And certainty, Bruce learned again and again, is always vulnerable to the unexpected. He recalls a night early in his partnership with the wider hero community, standing beside Wonder Woman after a confrontation with a minor Olympian who had wandered too far into the mortal world with too much anger and too little restraint. Diana had looked at him afterward with something between amusement and respect. "You didn't fight him," she said. "You unraveled him." "Gods don't expect to be studied," Bruce had answered. "They expect to be feared, or worshipped, or fought. Nobody ever just watches them, waits, learns their patterns like you'd learn a criminal's." Diana had considered that for a long moment. "That may be the most dangerous thing about you, Bruce. You refuse to be impressed." He thinks about that exchange now, tracing the edge of a journal filled with decades of divine profiling, habits, weaknesses, histories, contradictions. Every god, no matter how vast, carries a shape, a story about themselves they believe absolutely, and a story, once understood, can always be challenged. This became Bruce's method, refined across years and countless impossible nights. Observe as though the being in front of him was simply Gotham's latest, grandest criminal. Learn their beliefs, learn their history. Learn, above all, what they cannot tolerate being wrong about. Because, in Bruce's experience, that is where every god, no matter how ancient, no matter how powerful, could finally be reached. Not through strength, through understanding. He closes the journal gently and returns it to its place on the shelf, and moves on toward a case near the chamber's center, one holding a fragment of black metal, warped and scarred, radiating a stillness that feels less like silence and more like restrained weight. He already knows which memory waits behind the glass. Some names carry weight even in silence. Bruce stands before the case containing the fragment of black metal, and for a moment he says nothing at all. Not because there is nothing to say, but because there is too much, and none of it fits easily into words. Darkseid, the Lord of Apocalypse, a being whose very name seems to lower the temperature of any room it's spoken in. Bruce has fought him more times than he cares to count, alongside allies whose power dwarfs his own 1,000 times over. Superman, Wonder Woman, the full weight of the Justice League standing shoulder to shoulder against a tyranny old enough to have conquered galaxies before Earth had finished cooling. And yet, of all the members of that league, it is often Bruce whom Darkseid seems most curious about. The one without power, Darkseid once called him, during a confrontation Bruce still remembers with unsettling clarity. Not dismissively, almost, though he would never admit uncertainty about a god's tone, thoughtfully, as if a being capable of firing beams from his eyes that could unmake matter itself found something worth studying in a man who could not. Bruce understood why, eventually. Darkseid's power is not simply physical. It is philosophical. His entire existence is built upon a single, unshakable premise: the anti-life equation, the belief that free will is a flaw to be corrected, that every mind can be reduced to obedience if the right formula is found. Darkseid does not merely want to conquer worlds, he wants certainty. Absolute, universal certainty, where no variable remains unaccounted for, where every living being's next thought can be predicted and controlled. It is tyranny distilled into its purest form, the elimination of uncertainty itself. Bruce recalls one encounter more clearly than the others, a moment during an invasion of Earth when Darkseid stood amid the ruins of a city block, untouched by the combined efforts of heroes who could move planets, and turned his attention almost lazily toward Batman. "You continue to interfere," Darkseid said, "despite understanding that you cannot possibly affect the outcome." "Maybe," Bruce answered, "but you don't know that for certain, and that bothers you more than losing would." It was a small thing to say, a single sentence offered without weapons, without power, without any of the tools a god might respect. But Bruce had spent years building his profile of Darkseid, the same way he built profiles of Gotham's most dangerous minds, and he understood, with the clarity of a man who had solved 1,000 smaller mysteries, that certainty was the foundation of Darkseid's entire identity. Introduce a single crack of doubt, and even a god of his magnitude would react. That night, Bruce didn't defeat Darkseid through strength. No one present had the power to do that. Instead, he became the variable Darkseid's equation could never fully solve. A single mortal who refused to behave the way logic dictated he should, who kept standing after every calculation said he should fall, who kept planning after every probability said he should surrender. It was enough, not to win outright, but to buy the seconds Superman and Diana needed to turn the battle, to force Darkseid into a retreat he would never openly acknowledge as one. Later, Diana asked him how he'd managed to hold Darkseid's attention even for a moment. "I didn't fight him," Bruce said quietly. I just refuse to be predictable. Tyranny depends on certainty. I made sure he couldn't be certain of me. Standing here now, in the hush of the archive, Bruce turns the small fragment of apocalyptian metal over gently in his gloved hand before returning it to its resting place beneath the glass. He has never believed he defeated Darkseid. Not truly. Beings like that are not defeated so much as delayed, redirected, forced to retreat and recalculate. But he learns something vital from every encounter, that even a god who has calculated every variable in 1,000 universes can still be unsettled by a single human who refuses to behave the way gods expect humans to behave. Uncertainty, Bruce thinks, closing the case softly, is the one weapon tyranny can never fully account for. He steps past the pedestal at the chamber's center, the empty one, without looking at it directly, the way a man avoids glancing at an old scar in a mirror, and continues on toward the section of the archive filled with older magic, older gods, and older debts. The deeper Bruce walks into the chamber, the older the air begins to feel. Here, the artifacts are not scorched metal or alien alloy, but bone, wood, stone, and parchment. Relics tied not to distant planets, but to humanity's own earliest memories of the divine. Bruce slows his pace as he approaches this section, the way a man slows his steps in the presence of something that deserves patience. Magic was never Batman's strength. He has said as much, quietly, on more than one occasion, to Zatanna, to Constantine, even once to himself, alone in this very chamber. Where science offers rules, magic often offers riddles. Where physics gives consistent answers, magic seems to delight in contradiction. And yet Bruce has stood against beings of ancient magic more times than he ever expected to survive. He remembers the lords of order and chaos, beings whose influence shaped the earliest myths of nearly every human culture. Forces so old that the gods humanity worships today are, in some cosmologies, merely their descendants or their echoes. He remembers a knight standing in a temple hidden beneath the Vatican's oldest catacombs, facing a being who called himself simply the First Debt, a spirit older than written language, bound by a bargain struck at the dawn of human civilization. The First Debt did not attack him. It didn't need to. It simply spoke, and its voice unraveled certainty the way water unravels salt. "Mortal blood built my prison," it said. "Mortal blood shall free me." Bruce did not fight that night either. He researched. He spent 3 days without sleep, poring over the oldest texts Gotham's private archives and the Justice League's mystical libraries could provide, cross-referencing the phrase "mortal blood" across a dozen ancient languages until he found what he was looking for. Not a literal sacrifice, as the entity implied, but a symbolic one, an old bargain requiring a willing confession of guilt rather than a drop of blood spilled in violence. The entity had relied on the assumption that a modern human, disconnected from ancient tradition, would misunderstand its own binding. Bruce didn't. He knelt before the ancient altar not as a warrior, but as a penitent, and spoke aloud a confession, true, unpolished, deeply personal, of a moment from his own past he had never shared with another living soul. The temple shuddered. The First Debt recoiled, bound once more by the very tradition it had hoped a modern mind would have forgotten. Afterward, Zatanna found him still kneeling in the dark, exhausted, hollowed out from what the confession had cost him. "You beat an ancient god," she said gently, "with a secret." "I beat it with the truth," Bruce answered. "Old magic runs on old rules, promises, debts, symbols. It doesn't care how powerful you are. It cares whether you understand the contract." That, Bruce reflects now, standing before a case containing a fragment of that same ancient altar stone,
became one of the deepest truths of his years confronting the mystical unknown. Magic, no matter how vast, is rarely arbitrary. It is built on rules as rigid, in their own way, as the laws of physics, rules of binding and unbinding, of names and promises, of symbols that carry weight because countless generations of belief gave them weight. Gods of magic cannot simply be out-muscled. They must be out-understood. He recalls facing Circe, whose illusions could unravel a mind faster than any blade could cut it, and defeating her not through force, but by anchoring himself to a single, unchangeable fact about his own identity that her magic could never quite convince him to doubt. He recalls confronting minor avatars of chaos who could bend reality itself, undone not by strength, but by forcing them into structured, rule-bound scenarios that chaos, by its very nature, could not comfortably occupy. Every ancient god of magic he ever faced taught him some version of the same lesson. Power that is old is still power that follows rules. Find the rule. Respect it. Use it. Bruce steps back from the case, letting the memory settle, and turns his eyes briefly toward the ancient stone archway ahead, the one leading toward the section of the chamber he visits least often, where the air grows colder still, and where the artifacts seem less like relics and more like warnings. This is where the memory of Barbatos waits. There is a particular quality to true darkness, not the absence of light, but the presence of something that has simply always existed beneath it, patient, waiting for the light to fail on its own. Bruce feels that quality now as he steps beneath the final archway of this section of the chamber, where a single case holds something that defies easy description. A fragment of stone marked with a symbol shaped almost like a bat, though far older and far less comforting than the one stitched across his own chest. Barbatos. Bruce rarely speaks the name aloud, even here, alone. Some names feel like invitations. The being predates Gotham, predates humanity's earliest myths, in fact, an ancient force tied to fear itself, to the shadow that exists in every living mind, to the darkness beneath the world that every culture, in every era, has found some way to name and fear. Bruce discovered, during the strangest and most unsettling investigation of his career, that Gotham itself had been built, layer upon layer, atop ground touched by this presence for centuries. That the city's endless capacity to produce nightmares, to attract the strange and the monstrous, was not entirely coincidence. He remembers descending into the oldest tunnels beneath Gotham, older even than the Batcave itself, following a trail of impossible symbols scratched into stone by hands that predated the city's founders. He remembers the encroaching cold, the sensation of being watched by something that did not need eyes to see him. Barbatos did not speak to him the way Darkseid or the First Debt had spoken. It did something far more unsettling. It showed him visions, fragments of fear given form, every nightmare Bruce had ever suppressed, every private terror he had buried beneath years of discipline and control, rising up around him in the dark like smoke given shape. The death of his parents replayed, again and again, subtly altered each time, designed to erode the certainty he had built his entire identity upon. Any other man might have broken. Bruce nearly did. But somewhere in the depths of that vision, exhausted and frightened in a way he rarely allowed himself to feel, he remembered something his own training had taught him decades earlier, in a much smaller, much more human context. Fear grows in the dark because the dark is unexplored. Shine a light on it, examine it, understand its shape, and the fear begins to lose its grip. He stopped running from the visions. He began investigating them. Instead of resisting the images of his parents' deaths, he studied them, noting every detail Barbatos' illusion got wrong, every subtle inconsistency between the vision and his own carefully preserved memory. and with each inconsistency he identified, the illusion weakened, because Barbatos's power depended on unexamined fear, not examined memory. By the time he emerged from those tunnels, pale and shaking but resolute, he had not defeated Barbatos in any traditional sense. Ancient darkness like that is rarely defeated. It can only be understood, contained, respected as one respects the edge of a great cliff. But he had done something few beings, mortal or otherwise, had ever managed. He had looked directly into it and refused to look away. Diana once told him that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Bruce thinks of that lesson now, standing before the case, holding that ancient, bat-shaped symbol, tracing its edges with his eyes rather than his hands. Understanding the darkness weakens its hold. He wrote that in his private journal the night he returned from those tunnels, exhausted, forever changed. He has repeated the lesson to himself countless times since, in quieter moments, during sleepless nights when Gotham's shadows seem to stretch a little longer than they should. Even now, walking through this archive, built to hold memories most minds would rather forget, Bruce understands that Barbatos remains down there somewhere, beneath the city, beneath even this chamber, patient, ancient, waiting. Some enemies are never truly gone. They are simply, for now, understood well enough to be held at bay. He steps back from the case slowly, the cold of the memory lingering a moment longer than the others, and moves on toward a lighter part of the archive, one holding not weapons or warnings, but a simple, recurring pattern he has spent years coming to understand. Not every
Case in this chamber holds something frightening. Some hold something closer to irony. Bruce pauses now before a small glass display containing an ordinary object, a simple leather notebook, unremarkable except for a single scorch mark across its cover, souvenir of a night that could have ended very differently than it did. Across every encounter with divine and cosmic power Bruce has catalogued in this archive, one pattern repeats itself with almost comedic consistency. Gods, without exception, underestimate humanity. It isn't malice, usually. It's simply the natural consequence of scale. A being who has existed for 10,000 years, who has leveled cities with a thought, who commands forces mortal science cannot yet name, rarely pauses to consider that the small, fragile creature standing before them might be dangerous in ways that have nothing to do with strength. Bruce remembers a conversation with Superman on this exact subject, standing together on a rooftop overlooking Metropolis after a particularly harrowing encounter with a cosmic entity that had, in the end, been undone not by punches, but by a carefully planted piece of misinformation. "They never see you coming," Clark said, half in admiration, half in disbelief. "A being who can rewrite reality, and you beat him with a lie about his own name." "He assumed I was beneath his notice," Bruce answered. "Most of them do. That's not weakness on their part, Clark. That's just how power works. When you're strong enough for long enough, you stop paying attention to the things too small to threaten you. And that's exactly when the small things become dangerous." Bruce recalls an encounter with a minor Olympian, arrogant beyond even the standard of his pantheon, who mocked Batman openly for lacking any power at all. "What could a mortal possibly do to me?" the god had asked, genuinely curious, genuinely amused. "Notice things," Bruce had answered simply. He'd spent the previous week studying the god's temple, uncovering a detail nearly lost to history, a minor ritual insult, an old rival deity's name, deliberately invoked at precisely the right moment to trigger centuries of divine pride and jealousy. The god had abandoned his assault on Gotham entirely, consumed instead with proving his superiority to a rival who wasn't even present, giving the League the opening they needed to seal him away. He never lifted a fist. He simply understood, more thoroughly than the god understood himself, exactly which insecurities 10,000 years of worship hadn't managed to heal.
Bruce turns this observation over now, examining it with the same care he examines everything in this archive. Humility, he has come to believe, is not a limitation, it is an advantage disguised as a weakness. A god who assumes he cannot be threatened stops watching for threats. A detective who assumes he has no power learns instead to notice everything. And noticing in the right moment against the right opponent is its own kind of power. It is, Bruce reflects, perhaps the single greatest reason he has survived so many encounters that should have ended him instantly. Not because he was ever equal to the beings he faced, he never was, but because he never stopped thinking like the smallest person in the room, watching, listening, waiting for the crack that every god eventually reveals. He closes the case gently and turns toward the next section of the archive, where the artifacts grow quieter, more personal, relics not of victory, but of cost. Not every relic in this chamber represents a triumph. Bruce stops now before a small case holding nothing more dramatic than a folded, yellowed piece of paper. A page torn from an old journal, its ink faded but still legible if one looks closely enough. He doesn't open the case. He doesn't need to. He knows exactly what is written there, because he wrote it himself, on a night he has never fully told anyone about. There is a cost to standing among gods, even when you win. Especially, perhaps, when you win. Bruce has never spoken publicly about the toll these encounters take. The world sees the aftermath. Gotham saved, a threat repelled, the Justice League standing triumphant against impossible odds. What the world does not see is what happens afterward, in the quiet hours, when the adrenaline fades and the human mind is left alone with what it has witnessed. Sleep becomes difficult after facing something that predates human history. Bruce learned this early and never fully unlearned it. There is a particular kind of insomnia that settles in after staring into the eyes of a being who has watched empires rise and crumble the way a person watches weather change. A sense that the universe is far larger, far older, and far less concerned with human survival than anyone comfortably assumes. He remembers nights after facing Darkseid, lying awake in the manor above, staring at the ceiling, turning over a single, unanswerable question. If beings like that exist, entire philosophies built around domination and control, what does it mean that humanity survives at all? Luck? Persistence? Or simply because we haven't yet become interesting enough to be erased? He remembers nights after the tunnels beneath Gotham, after Barbatos, when even Wayne Manor's familiar shadows felt subtly wrong, as though something ancient had followed him home and simply chosen, for now, to remain unseen. He has never told Alfred the full truth of those nights, though Bruce suspects the old man understood more than he ever let on, bringing tea to the study at exactly the moments Bruce needed a human voice nearby, without ever asking why. Once, and only once, Bruce admitted the full weight of it to Diana, during a quiet moment after a particularly brutal encounter with an ancient cosmic force that had very nearly ended all of them. "Does it ever stop?" he asked her. "The weight of knowing what's actually out there?" Diana considered the question with the patience of someone who had lived far longer than her appearance suggested. "No," she said finally, "but you learn to carry it differently. You stop asking why the universe allows such things to exist, and you start asking what you're going to do about them, today, with the people in front of you. That's the only answer any of us ever find, Bruce. It isn't peace. It's purpose instead of peace." Bruce has carried that answer with him ever since, though it has never fully erased the weight itself. He has come to accept a difficult truth. Perhaps a human mind was never entirely meant to hold the knowledge of what waits beyond the edges of ordinary life. Perhaps that is precisely why so few people ever glimpse it, and why those who do, heroes, mystics, unlucky witnesses pulled briefly into extraordinary circumstances, often carry the experience like a quiet, permanent scar. Bruce chose to carry that weight anyway, not because he wanted to, because someone in Gotham, in this world, needed to stand at that boundary and hold the line, even at personal cost. He looks at the folded page beneath the glass a moment longer, a page filled, he knows, with a single sleepless night's worth of doubt he allowed himself only once, in private, before folding the page shut and never revisiting those exact words again. Then he steps onward, toward a wider section of the archive, where the relics are arranged not around individual encounters, but around the memory of standing beside others who understood, without needing to be told, exactly what that cost required. The next section of the chamber is arranged differently from the rest. Instead of individual cases scattered across the stone floor, this area holds a long table, and upon it rest small tokens: a fragment of Themysciran metal, a shard of Kryptonian crystal, a torn piece of a Green Lantern's ring housing, a burnt page from a Flash's costume. Each item, Bruce reflects, represents not his encounter alone, but a moment the entire League faced together and chose never to speak of publicly. There is a particular kind of silence that follows a battle against something truly beyond comprehension. Not the comfortable silence of victory, but a heavier, more complicated quiet, born from having witnessed something no press conference or public statement could ever adequately explain. Bruce remembers the days following the League's confrontation with an entity from beyond the known multiverse, a being whose true form none of them could fully perceive, whose mere presence had unraveled probability itself across half a continent before they managed, together, to force it back beyond the boundary of reality. Afterward, there was no celebration, no press conference. Clark suggested quietly that some victories are better left unexplained to a public that could never process the truth without unraveling their own sense of safety. Diana agreed immediately, with the practiced ease of someone from a culture long accustomed to keeping certain truths sacred rather than public. Even the more outspoken members of the League, Hal, Barry, fell unusually silent in the days that followed, each carrying the memory privately, processing it in whatever way suited them best. Bruce remembers a meeting in the watchtower days after that encounter where the seven of them sat together in a rare, unscheduled silence, none quite ready to speak first. It was Diana, finally, who broke it. "We don't have to explain what we saw," she said quietly. "We only have to remember it together. That's enough. That's how burdens like this are meant to be carried. Not alone, and not loudly. Just together, quietly, so none of us has to hold the whole weight alone." Bruce has thought about that moment often since. It reshaped, in a small but significant way, his understanding of teamwork itself. He had spent so many years operating alone, convinced that Gotham's particular darkness required a singular, uncompromising will. But facing gods, truly facing them, standing shoulder to shoulder with others who understood the scale of what they were confronting, taught him something his solitary war on crime never had. Some burdens are too large for any single mind to carry safely. Not because the mind is weak, but because certain truths were never meant to be held in isolation. He remembers the quiet camaraderie that followed such encounters, not celebration, but something gentler. Clark bringing coffee to the watchtower's observation deck at 3 a.m, sitting beside Bruce without a word, simply present. Diana occasionally recounting old Themysciran stories about mortals who witnessed divine truths and found ways to continue living meaningful lives afterward, offering comfort not through solutions, but through the simple reassurance that others, across centuries, had faced similar weight and found ways forward. This, Bruce reflects now, tracing his fingers lightly along the edge of the long table, is the League's quietest secret. Not the battles themselves, dramatic as they were, but the quiet, private aftermath. The unspoken agreement among all of them to remember together rather than forget alone. To carry the knowledge of what waits beyond ordinary life, not as trauma to bury, but as a shared, sacred responsibility. He straightens, looking once more down the long table of small, unremarkable tokens, each one representing a night none of them ever fully explained to the world. Then he turns, walking on toward the final major section of the archive, the place where every lesson from every encounter finally converges into something resembling wisdom. Near the far wall of the chamber, arranged with unusual care, rests a smaller collection of items, not grouped by the being they came from, but by the lesson each encounter left behind. Bruce stands before this section longer than any other. It is, in many ways, the true purpose of this entire archive. Not a museum of victories, but a record of everything the impossible has taught an ordinary man about how to remain human in its presence. Patience first. He remembers a small stone tablet, nearly weightless, unremarkable in appearance, recovered after an encounter with a minor deity of time itself, a being who had attempted to convince Bruce that mortal urgency was, in the grand scheme of eternity, meaningless. Bruce had won that encounter not through cleverness or force, but through simple, stubborn patience, waiting out an illusion designed to provoke hasty action, allowing the deity's own impatience with mortal slowness to eventually work against it. Gods, he learned that night, often assume urgency is a mortal weakness. Sometimes, refusing to hurry is the only weapon a mortal needs. Mercy, second. He recalls a fragment of golden thread recovered from an encounter with a fallen avatar of vengeance, a being who had once been worshipped for delivering justice, but had, over centuries, become consumed entirely by cruelty disguised as righteousness. Bruce had the opportunity, in that final confrontation, to end the being permanently. He chose instead to offer a path toward redemption, understanding that mercy, extended even to beings capable of tremendous harm, often revealed more about their true nature than any punishment could. Some, he learned, could not be redeemed, but the attempt itself mattered, because mercy withheld too easily becomes cruelty disguised as justice, the very thing he had sworn since childhood never to become. Responsibility, third. A small brass key, unremarkable and slightly tarnished, recovered from a vault he once helped seal alongside Zatanna, a vault meant to contain knowledge so dangerous that even understanding it fully would unravel a mortal mind. Bruce had wanted to study its contents fully, driven by the same relentless curiosity that had solved every mystery Gotham ever presented him. Zatanna had stopped him. "Not every door is meant to be opened, Bruce," she said. "Sometimes the responsible thing isn't solving the mystery, it's protecting the world from the answer." He kept the key as a reminder. Knowledge, unlike criminal evidence, is not always meant to be fully uncovered. Some truths are dangerous not because they're false, but because they're true in ways the world isn't ready to survive. Hope, fourth. A small, cracked mirror shard, recovered from an encounter with a being who fed on despair itself, growing stronger with every surrendered hope, every abandoned dream. Bruce, of all people, a man who had built his entire identity around Gotham's darkest corners, had defeated that being not through darkness, but by refusing, even in the depths of an encounter designed to strip hope away entirely, to stop believing Gotham was worth saving. "You're the last person I expected to defeat me with hope," the entity had said, weakening as its power drained away. "I'm not hopeful because it's easy," Bruce answered. "I'm hopeful because giving up has never once solved anything in this city. Not once." And finally, humility. A simple, unremarkable stone, smooth, ordinary, indistinguishable from any stone one might find on any riverbank in Gotham. Bruce keeps it not because of any single encounter, but because of everything every encounter, together, ultimately taught him. No victory, across every impossible night catalogued in this chamber, ever came from strength alone. Every single one came from understanding. Patient, careful, humble understanding, paired with the simple, stubborn refusal to stop trying, even when facing beings whose power made resistance seem, by every reasonable measure, entirely futile. Bruce looks over this final collection a long moment, feeling something settle quietly in his chest. Not triumph, exactly. Something closer to gratitude, complicated and hard-earned. Then he turns, finally, toward the center of the chamber, toward the empty pedestal that has waited, patient and silent, since the moment he first stepped into this archive tonight. It is time. Bruce walks slowly toward the center of the chamber, past case after case now returned to stillness, past journals closed and relics resting quietly beneath their glass. The empty pedestal waits exactly where it has always waited, beneath the tallest archway, illuminated by a single beam of amber light that seems, deliberately or not, brighter than the light surrounding every other display in the room. He stops before it now, hands clasped loosely behind his back, and allows himself, finally, to look at it directly. For years, even those rare few who have glimpsed this archive, Alfred, Diana once briefly, Dick, have asked him quietly about this pedestal. What once rested here? What relic could possibly be significant enough to warrant such careful placement, and yet important enough to remain absent? Bruce has never fully answered that question. Not because he doesn't know the answer, because the answer is more complicated than any label could capture. There was an encounter, once, that Bruce has never spoken of publicly, and rarely revisits even in the privacy of his own thoughts. A being he faced entirely alone, without the League, without any ally beside him, during a period of his life he has otherwise chosen to leave undocumented, even in this chamber built specifically to document the undocumentable. He will not describe the being itself. Some things, he has come to believe, do not need to be preserved as legend. Some victories are not meant to become stories, told and retold, however carefully, however respectfully. Some are meant to remain exactly what they were in the moment they happened, quiet acts of responsibility, undertaken because someone needed to act and no one else was present to do so. What Bruce will say, what he allows himself to think standing here now, before the empty pedestal, is this. That encounter taught him the final, most important lesson of everything cataloged in this archive. Not every act of courage needs to be remembered. Not every victory needs a trophy. Some of the most important moments in a life spent standing against impossible odds are precisely the ones that vanish quietly afterward, known only to the person who lived them, carried forward not as pride, but as private resolve. The pedestal remains empty because Bruce made a deliberate choice years ago that this particular memory would never become a legend. It would remain instead exactly what it always was, an act of quiet responsibility, undertaken without witness, without reward, without the need for permanence. He built this entire archive to remember, but he left this single pedestal empty to remind himself that remembering everything is not always necessary or even healthy. Some things are meant to be carried quietly within, not displayed, however respectfully, behind glass. Bruce reaches out now, resting his gloved hand briefly against the smooth, empty surface of the pedestal. The closest he has ever come, in all his years maintaining this chamber, to acknowledging aloud what it represents. Then, gently, he steps back. One by one,
he begins retracing his steps through the archive, checking each case as he passes, ensuring every relic rests securely in its place. The fragment from the burned church, the shard of apocalyptian metal, the ancient altar stone, the small bat-shaped symbol from the tunnels beneath Gotham, the long table of tokens shared silently among the League. The final collection, representing patience, mercy, responsibility, hope, and humility. Each one settles back into stillness as he passes, the dim amber light catching briefly on glass before fading again into shadow. These are not trophies, he reminds himself, the way he has reminded himself every single time he has walked this path. They are reminders that even gods can make mistakes, can underestimate, can be wrong about their own certainty, and that even humans, fragile and mortal and profoundly outmatched by every reasonable measure, can stand against impossible odds and, through patience and understanding rather than power, occasionally prevail. He reaches the elevator at last, pausing once more at its threshold, looking back across the vast, dust-lit chamber one final time before departing. The empty pedestal remains exactly where it has always remained, visible, deliberate, unexplained to anyone who does not already understand. Bruce allows himself a small, quiet breath. Then he steps into the elevator, and the ancient doors slide shut behind him. The elevator rises slowly, carrying Bruce back up through layers of stone and memory, back toward the familiar hum of the Batcave above. When the doors finally open, the cave greets him exactly as it always does, the distant waterfall murmuring steadily in the dark, the trophies standing silent guard along the walls, the monitors casting their pale, patient light across empty terminals. Nothing here has changed, and yet Bruce feels, as he always does after these quiet visits to the archive below, subtly altered. Lighter in some ways, heavier in others, carrying forward lessons that will, inevitably, prove useful again, far sooner than he'd like. He climbs the stairs toward the manor above, removing the cowl as he goes, feeling Gotham's night finally beginning to loosen its grip on his shoulders. Outside, the rain has softened to little more than a whisper against the windows, the storm having spent most of its strength hours earlier, while Bruce walked, unhurried, among gods and memories far below. Alfred is waiting in the study, as he so often is, a pot of tea prepared without needing to be asked. He glances up as Bruce enters, taking in with the practiced eye of a man who has watched over him for decades, the particular quality of tiredness that only a visit to the hidden archive produces.
Productive night? Alfred asks, pouring the tea. Educational, Bruce answers, settling into the chair across from him. Alfred says nothing further, understanding, as he always has, precisely how much space to leave around Bruce's silences. They sit together for a while in comfortable quiet, the fire crackling gently in the hearth, the storm fading steadily outside the tall windows. Eventually, grey morning light begins creeping across the study floor, chasing the last shadows of night toward the corners of the room. Somewhere beyond the manor's walls, Gotham is beginning to stir, delivery trucks rumbling awake on distant streets, early commuters filling the first trains of the day, the city's endless, restless heartbeat resuming its familiar rhythm, entirely unaware of everything that rests, quiet and patient, in the stone chamber far beneath its foundations. Bruce finishes his tea slowly, watching the light strengthen outside. He thinks, briefly, of the empty pedestal, of the choice he made, years ago, to leave one victory unrecorded, uncelebrated,
carried only within himself. He thinks of Diana's words about purpose replacing peace. He thinks of every journal, every relic, every fragment of impossible history resting silently below, waiting for the day another impossible mystery demands he descend those stairs once more. He does not know when that day will come. He knows only that, when it does, he will be ready, not because he possesses the strength to match whatever waits for him, but because he has spent a lifetime learning, patiently and humbly, that strength was never truly the point. Understanding was. Somewhere far below Wayne Manor, beneath the familiar Batcave, beneath even the ancient chamber holding decades of impossible memory, the hidden archive rests now in complete silence. Dust settling once more across stone floors that have waited patiently for centuries, and will continue waiting patiently for however many centuries remain. Above, morning fully arrives. Gotham wakes, indifferent and unaware, exactly as it always has, exactly as Bruce has always wanted it to remain. And somewhere between the city's ordinary morning and the archive's ancient silence, Bruce Wayne allows himself, finally, to rest, carrying forward, quietly, the comforting and complicated truth that even in a universe filled with gods, tyrants, and ancient darkness beyond imagining, it was never power that carried him through. It was patience. It was mercy. It was humility. It was hope. It was, simply and completely, his humanity. And in a universe built on gods, that has always been more than enough.